December 14th, 1945, Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. The smell hit first, sharp lye, biting, and cold. Hana gripped the younger girl's shoulder, pulling Yuki back from the gleaming white object. It looked like a porcelain chair, impossibly clean. A posted sign, hand-painted in careful katakana, read, "Sanitation, use as directed." Yuki whispered, "Hana-san, they sit on it?" A heavy boot scraped the concrete floor. A WAC guard, a private, stood in the doorway. Her presence routine, not threatening. She saw their hesitation. The guard pointed, not unkindly. "It's all right. It's for sanitation." The WAC pulled a metal chain. A sudden, violent roar of water erupted, swallowing the silence. Yuki flinched, hiding her face in Hana's thin coat. Hana stared at the swirling vortex, then at the soft roll of paper hanging on the wall, a luxury she couldn't comprehend. This quiet confusion, repeated in camps across America, was its own strange frontier. We invite you to subscribe and share if you know of similar stories from your own heritage. It was a long way from the quiet dignity of their old life. 6 weeks earlier, the decks of the USS Mercy, Pacific Ocean. The cold was not the damp, salty chill of the coast. This was a dry, invasive cold that pierced the thin wool of their coats and settled deep in the bone. It found the cracks in Hana's spirit. They were herded from the back of the canvas-covered truck, their feet landing on ground that was frozen solid and covered in a layer of white powder. Hana had never seen snow like this. It crunched loudly under the heavy boots of the American guards. Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. The name felt alien on the tongue, a place beyond any map she knew. Hana kept her gaze fixed downward, studying the frozen dirt, avoiding the eyes of the guards. These American soldiers were women, wax, their faces pink from the cold, their expressions obscured by the steam of their own breath. They were tall, impassive, carrying no rifles, only short wooden batons that swung lightly from their belts. Hana held tightly to Yuki's arm. The younger girl, barely 16, shivered violently, her teeth chattering in a rhythm of pure terror. "Stay close," Hana murmured, her own voice tight. "Do not look up. Do not speak." Propaganda leaflets had prepared them for monsters, for grinning demons with bayonets. These women were simply large and silent. Their silence was its own form of intimidation, a void that Hana filled with images of grainy newspaper photos, of violence, of humiliation. She expected a blow, a shout, a shove into a muddy pit. Every quiet command from the guards felt like the pause before the strike. They were marched toward a long, low building of dark, unpainted wood. This is it, Hana thought, her stomach tightening. The punishment shed. The freezing room. She had heard stories from other prisoners on the transport ship, whispers of men left in unheated cells until their limbs turned black. A whack. Sergeant, broad-shouldered and carrying a clipboard, pushed open the heavy wooden door. She barked an order. "Inside, move." Hana pushed Yuki gently ahead of her, bracing herself against the expected stench of waste and sickness. Instead, a wave of heat struck her face. It was a dry, pulsing warmth, thick with the scent of pine and burning coal. Hana stopped, blinking against the sudden brightness. The interior was not a dark pit. It was a long, cavernous room, lit by bare electric bulbs. Down the center ran a large, black metal stove, radiating a heat so intense it shimmered in the air. On either side were rows of metal cots, stacked 2 high, each with a mattress and 2 folded blankets. The wooden floors were swept clean. The women behind Hana pushed forward, drawn by the heat, but they too hesitated at the threshold. This clean, warm space was a profound disorientation. It did not align with their expectations of enmity. Bunks! 2 per, the sergeant commanded, pointing. Hana quickly guided Yuki to a lower bunk near the middle of the room, away from the cold draft of the door. She placed her hand on the mattress. It was rough, but it was dry. She touched the wool blankets. They were coarse, heavy, and clean. She sat on the edge of the cot, her body soaking in the warmth, but her mind remained cold with suspicion. Why? Why keep prisoners in such conditions? Why waste fuel on captured nurses and civilians? This comfort felt dishonest. It felt like a trick, a softening before a far more terrible psychological blow. The sergeant returned, walking down the aisle as the women settled. She stopped at Hana and Yuki's bunk. She tossed 2 small, hard objects onto the mattress. Hana picked one up. It was a bar of soap wrapped in crisp paper. She could smell a faint flowery scent through the packaging. It was not the rough brown lye soap of the field hospitals. It was a personal, perfect rectangle. The wax sergeant pointed to a closed door at the far end of the barrack. Latrine, wash, curfew in 10 minutes. Latrine. The word echoed among the women. Hana looked at the small, wrapped bar in her hand. This bar of soap felt impossibly civilized. She gripped it tightly, the sharp corners pressing into her palm. She helped Yuki stand up. Whatever waited behind that second door, it was the next test. Hana kept her hand tight on Yuki's arm. The small, paper-wrapped bar of soap was still in her other hand, its sharp corners a grounding, tangible reality. She and Yuki fell in line behind the other women, walking stiffly toward the closed door marked latrine. The cold of the barrack floor seeped through their thin tabi socks. Hana expected the sharp stench of a pit, the familiar, earthy odor of waste. She pushed the door open. The smell that hit her was chemical, sharp, and sterile. It was the scent of lye, so strong it burned the back of her throat. And the light. It was blinding. Not a single dim bulb, but several, humming brightly, reflecting off every surface. The room was made of concrete and gleaming white tile, and lining the walls were the objects. Hana stopped dead. Yuki bumped into her from behind. They were not trenches. They were not wooden boxes over a hole. They were thrones. White, gleaming porcelain thrones sitting squat and solid on the floor, their surfaces shining wetly under the harsh electric light. Each one had its own wooden partition, a small stall, but the objects themselves were exposed, arrogant in their strangeness. The women murmured, a low sound of confusion. "What are they?" Yuki whispered, hiding behind Hana's shoulder. Hana did not answer. She was looking at the water sitting placidly in the bottom of the white bowls. She was looking at the strange metal levers attached to the tanks behind them. This was the latrine. This was the place of waste. But it was cleaner than the field hospital surgery theater. This contradiction was a quiet violence. It made no sense. The minutes were ticking toward curfew. The WWII guards would be checking. To fail this simple, basic task, to be found ignorant of sanitation, was a humiliation they could not afford. They were nurses, symbols of cleanliness. Then, Hana saw Mrs. Sato, a woman in her 50s who had been a midwife in Nagasaki, move forward. Her face was a mask of determination, tinged with deep embarrassment. She entered one of the small stalls. Hana watched, unable to look away. Mrs. Sato looked at the porcelain chair. She looked at the floor. She clearly did not understand the mechanism. She glanced back at the other women, her face burning red. Then she turned back. Hana watched as the midwife hitched up the hem of her worn kimono, placed one foot on the floor, and then lifted the other. She tried to place her sandal onto the curved, slippery white rim of the seat. She was trying to climb onto it to achieve the familiar, stable squat. She wobbled precariously. Her sandal scraped loudly against the porcelain. Hana felt a hot wave of shame wash over her. It was not shame for Mrs. Sato. It was a collective shame. A deep, profound sense of inadequacy. They were primitives. They were savages who did not even know how to use a toilet. The Americans did not need to mock them. The porcelain chairs did it for them, silently, gleamingly. Yuki whimpered. "I cannot, Hana-san. I do not know how." Hana looked at the porcelain chair nearest her. She saw her own exhausted reflection in the tank water. She could not bring herself to try, and she could not bear to fail as Mrs. Sato had. "We will wait," Hana whispered, her voice like steel. She pulled Yuki backward, out of the sterile, bright room. They returned to their bunk in the warm, pine-scented barrack. They hid their unused bars of soap under their pillows. They would hold it. They would wait until morning, until the darkness offered privacy, and they would find a place outside. They would not be defeated by a toilet. Avoidance could not last. Biology was a more immediate tyrant than the United States Army. By the second night, the situation had become desperate. The latrine became a place of furtive, failed experiments. Hana saw the evidence during the brief moments she forced herself to enter. Muddy sandal prints on the curved white seats, splashes of water on the concrete floor. The women who were brave enough, or desperate enough, were trying to adapt the object to their bodies. They were climbing onto the porcelain chairs and squatting, just as Hana had seen Mrs. Sato attempt. It was an unstable, undignified, and messy solution. The sterile, chemical smell of lye was now overlaid with the faint, sour odor of human failure. The wacky guards were clearly angered. Their voices were sharper during the morning roll call. Hana watched one of them, the tall private from the first night, enter the latrine with a mop and a metal bucket that echoed loudly in the tiled room. The guard scrubbed the floor and the bases of the toilets with a frustrated violence, sighing heavily. This, Hana realized, was the new danger. The Americans, with their obsession with cleanliness, would not see this as confusion. They would see it as sabotage, as willful filth. As a nurse, Hana was horrified. The lack of proper sanitation was a direct path to dysentery. As a prisoner, she was terrified. This failure to understand a basic function made them vulnerable. That evening, just before curfew, Hana decided she had to try. She had to understand the mechanism. She waited until the latrine was empty. The bright lights hummed. Water dripped slowly from one of the faucets. She approached the nearest stall, her heart pounding. She looked at the porcelain chair, this cold, white enigma. She touched its surface. It was smooth, flawless. She pushed the small metal lever on the tank, flinching, ready to jump back. The roar of water was just as startling as it had been in the cold open, but this time she watched. She saw the vortex spin, clean the bowl, and refill itself. It was a machine, a self-cleaning machine. She turned her attention to the small object mounted on the wall beside it. She had ignored it the day before, her focus entirely on the throne itself. It was a roll of paper. She reached out a hesitant finger and touched it. Her breath caught. It was soft. It was impossibly, luxuriously soft. It was white, pliable, and felt warmer than the porcelain. She pulled a small piece. It tore away cleanly along a line of tiny holes. She rubbed it between her thumb and forefinger. Back home there was chirigami. That paper was rough, gray, salvaged from old documents or rice bags, bought in stacks. You folded it carefully. Sometimes you even washed it. Paper was precious. Paper was for letters to family, for official orders, for knowledge. This American paper. It was softer than the silk of a good kimono, and it was here, in a latrine, intended to be soiled and discarded immediately. A wave of guilt, sharp and profound, struck Hana. To use something so fine for such a purpose was more than waste. It felt like sacrilege. It was a decadent act. She stood there, holding the small, soft square, the evidence of a wealth she could not comprehend. This was the true power. Not the guards, not the fences, but the ability to throw this away. A noise at the door made her drop the paper as if it had burned her. The Wace private entered, the same one. She was not carrying a mop this time, but a piece of cardboard and a jar of paste. She looked at Hana, not with anger, but with a deep, weary exasperation. The private ignored her. She walked to the main wall and began spreading paste on the cardboard. Then she affixed it for all to see. It was a diagram, a simple, wordless drawing. It showed two figures. The first, a figure squatting on the porcelain seat, was crossed out with a large red X. The second figure, sitting properly, was circled in green. Hana stared at it, her face burning. They were now officially children, needing a picture to explain the most private act. The illustrated sign on the latrine wall was a declaration of their failure, but it was also, reluctantly, a guide. Within a day, the awkward attempts to squat on the rims ceased. A new tense order emerged. The women learned to use the porcelain thrones as intended, though they did so with a stiff reluctance, a sense of performing an alien ritual. Then came the work rosters. Hana's name was listed under latrine and bathhouse sanitation. A cold dread settled in her stomach. It was one thing to be forced to use the strange devices. It was another entirely to be forced into intimacy with them, to clean them. It felt like the ultimate degradation, a task designed to break her spirit as a nurse. She reported for duty with two other women. A WAS corporal, chewing gum rhythmically, met them at the door. She did not speak. She simply pointed to a locked supply closet, unlocked it, and handed them rubber gloves, long-handled brushes, and a large cardboard drum of white cleaning powder. Hana pulled on the gloves. They felt thick and clumsy, smelling of rubber. She scooped the gritty white powder into a bucket, added water as she had seen the guard do, and watched it fizz. The chemical smell was sharp, identical to the sterile scent that had first assaulted her. She had associated it with the guards. Now she understood it was a tool. She entered the first stall, her bucket and brush in hand. Her target was waiting, the porcelain chair. It was no longer an object of pure terror, but one of resentful acquaintance. She knelt before it. This was the posture that felt most wrong, like kneeling in supplication to an idol of waste. She dipped the brush into the caustic water and began to scrub. At first, her movements were hesitant, fearful of touching the wrong part, of breaking the complex machine. She scrubbed the bowl, her eyes shut tightly, focusing on the sound of the bristles against the ceramic. But as she worked, her nurse's training began to take over. This was not filth. It was a sanitation challenge. Her focus shifted from disgust to thoroughness. She scrubbed the rim, the seat, the outside of the bowl, and as she cleaned, she began to see it. She saw how the tank on the back was connected by a large pipe. She saw how the bowl itself was a complex, curved piece of engineering designed to hold water at a precise level. She followed the pipes with her eyes, seeing how they disappeared into the concrete wall connected to a larger system she could not see. This was not just a chair. It was the visible tip of an enormous hidden infrastructure. Her fear began to recede, replaced by a cold, technical curiosity. Where did the water come from? The camp was on a frozen hill, yet endless clean water was available at the pull of a lever. Where did the waste go? It vanished, swallowed by the wall, taken miles away, instantly. In Japan, waste was manual. It was carried. It was used as fertilizer. It was a constant physical presence. Here, waste simply disappeared. She finished scrubbing. The porcelain chair gleamed, spotless. She felt a strange, reluctant flicker of professional pride. She had conquered it. There was one final test. She stood up, her knees stiff. She looked at the metal lever. She had seen the diagram. She understood the function. Now she had to command it herself. She wrapped her gloved hand around the handle and pushed down. The roar of water was immediate, deafening in the small stall. It felt like unleashing a caged animal. She watched, mesmerized as the vortex formed, powerful and perfect, cleaning her work away, refilling the bowl with fresh, clear water. It was loud, it was violent, and it was brilliant. She stepped back, her heart beating quickly. She was not afraid of the sound anymore. She was startled by its power. Her task was complete. The last porcelain throne gleamed, the water in its bowl clear and still. Hana felt a cold, weary satisfaction. She had faced the machine, and she understood it. As she rinsed the long-handled brush, she noticed the roll of paper in the stall she had just cleaned was dwindling. Only a thin layer remained on the cardboard tube. It was a small detail, but having learned the system, she felt a sudden, inexplicable responsibility to it. She would be blamed if it ran out. She stepped out of the latrine. The WWII corporal was at the end of the barrack hallway, locking the main supply room. Hana pointed toward the empty stall. "Paper," she said, the English word feeling clumsy in her mouth. "Empty." The corporal let out an exasperated sigh, as if Hana was interrupting a more important task. She retrieved a different key from the ring on her belt and walked back, not to the main supply room, but to the small, unmarked closet door next to the latrine entrance. Hana had assumed it held mops. "Refill," the corporal ordered, turning the key. "Take one." She pulled the door open and stepped aside to let Hana pass. Hana stepped across the threshold, expecting a small dark space with a few shelves. The smell hit her first. It was not the sharp chemical bite of lye or the dampness of the bathhouse. It was a dry, clean, papery scent, almost sweet, like a library or a stationery store. A single, bare bulb hummed overhead, illuminating the small room. Hana froze. It was not a closet. It was a vault. From the floor to the ceiling, stacked in precise, dense columns, were the soft paper rolls. They were not in dozens. They were in hundreds, thousands. The room was perhaps 10 feet deep, and every inch of the back wall was a mountain of soft white cylinders wrapped tightly in brown paper bundles. They were packed so densely they formed a solid wall of industrial surplus. Hana simply stared. Her mind went blank. She could not process the scale. This was not a week's supply. This was not a month's supply. This looked like a supply for an entire army, for an entire year. This was a monument to disposability. She thought of her mother, back in Kagoshima, carefully smoothing out old newspapers to be used in the outhouse. She thought of the rough, gray paper that was bought in small stacks and used sparingly, every square centimeter precious. She thought of the wartime rationing, where paper was so scarce that letters were written in the margins of old books. And here, in a prison camp, in the middle of a frozen wasteland, the Americans had built a mountain of paper soft as silk, designed to be thrown away. The profound sense of wastefulness she had felt when she first touched that single, delicate square, it was not an anomaly. It was the fundamental principle. This was the true face of the enemy. It was not a demonic soldier. It was this. It was the calm, casual, almost boring abundance that allowed for such a mountain to exist. How can you fight this? She thought. It was a terrifying, hollow realization. How can you win against a country that can afford to flush a forest? "Take one," the corporal repeated, her voice impatient. She tapped her boot. Hana's hand was trembling. She reached out and touched the nearest bundle. It was solid, heavy. She pulled a single paper roll free. It felt dense, perfect. She held it in her palm. It felt heavier than a grenade. It was the weight of an entire economy, of a power so vast it did not even need to display itself, except here, in a forgotten closet, in the form of endless paper. A few weeks passed. The routines of Camp McCoy became a brittle, frozen normality. The shock of the latrine had subsided, replaced by a grudging, mechanical acceptance. On a Sunday, a list was posted. Women were permitted to attend a service at the camp chapel, followed by a supervised sewing circle. Hannah signed her name, not from any religious impulse, but from a deep need for a change of walls. The pine-scented barrack, once a warm refuge, had become its own small prison. She walked with Yuki and 3 other women, escorted by a single unarmed guard. The chapel was a simple wooden building, identical to their barrack, but for a small, unadorned cross above the door. Hannah expected a cold, austere room, perhaps a stern lecture. Instead, she was met by the smell of roasted coffee and warm cinnamon. The service, which they had arrived at the tail end of, was just concluding. A handful of whacks, the same guards from the barracks, were singing a hymn, their voices blending with the reedy notes of a small pump organ. They were not singing as soldiers, but as young women. When the song finished, a woman in a uniform Hannah hadn't seen before, a dark tunic with a small silver cross pinned to the collar, stood up. She was the chaplain. She smiled at the Japanese women standing awkwardly by the door. "Please come in. The sewing circle is this way. We have coffee." Hannah hesitated. This was not a formal proceeding. It was social. The guards were already filtering into an adjoining room where a large coffee urn steamed on a table. Beside it sat several pies in round tins, their crusts golden brown. This was another layer of disorientation. These were her jailers. Yet here they were, participating in the most mundane of American rituals, Sunday coffee. Hannah and the other Japanese women were led to a table piled with mending, socks, uniforms, tablecloths. Hannah picked up a sock, her fingers automatically finding the hole in the heel. It was familiar work. As she sewed, she watched. She watched the guards laugh quietly among themselves. She watched them pour dark coffee into thick ceramic mugs. The female chaplain approached her. She was holding a porcelain plate. On it was a large slice of apple pie. "You're Hannah, aren't you? You sew very neatly," the chaplain said in clear, simple English. "Please have some." Hannah looked at the offering. The pie was steaming slightly. The smell of cooked apples and cinnamon was overwhelming, a scent of home, of kitchens, of a life long past. She reached out to take it. Her fingers brushed the plate. It was smooth, white, and heavy. It was porcelain. She froze. It was the exact same material as the toilets, the same cold, flawless, gleaming white. The chaplain, seeing her hesitation, smiled gently. "It's just apple pie." Hannah took the plate. She sat there, holding this impossible contradiction. In her world, materials were hierarchical. A material for a latrine could never be the same material for a dinner plate. It was a violation. But here, it was not. She looked from the clean white plate in her hands to the white ceramic mug a guard was drinking from. She thought of the white porcelain thrones she had scrubbed that morning. The realization struck her with the force of a physical blow. It was not a contradiction. It was a standard. To these Americans, this level of cleanliness, this quality of material, was so basic, so abundant, that it was used for everything. It was used for the lowest, most private bodily functions, and it was used for the simple, communal pleasure of eating pie. The abundance she had seen in the paper closet was not an anomaly. It was the foundation. She took a small bite of the pie. It was sweet, warm, and utterly confusing. Her compliance in the chapel, and her diligence in the latrine sanitation roster earned Hannah a new assignment. It was considered a promotion. She was assigned to the small team that cleaned the administration block, the offices of the camp commandant and his adjutants. This work was different. It was quiet, solitary. It required trust, or perhaps just the assumption that she was too cowed to be a threat. She preferred it. The offices were intensely warm, heated by metal radiators that hissed gently against the walls. The air smelled of sharp black coffee, pipe tobacco, and mimeograph ink. Her task was simple: empty the metal wastebaskets, sweep the wooden floors, and dust the desks. She kept her eyes down, focusing on the gray swirls of dust, on the boot prints tracked in from the snow outside. She learned to make herself invisible, a ghost polishing the mechanisms of her own captivity. One afternoon, while emptying the wastebasket in the adjutant's office, she saw a local newspaper lying open on his desk, the Monroe County Democrat. Her English, learned at the mission school in Nagasaki, was rudimentary but functional. She could read headlines. She could understand simple sentences. She felt a cold prickle of fear. She knew what newspapers said about her people. Jap, monkey, yellow peril. She had seen the cartoons on leaflets dropped from planes. To read this paper felt like volunteering for an execution, but she could not stop her eyes from scanning the page. She was not looking at the main headlines about the war tribunals in Europe. Her gaze was caught by a smaller column on the side, an editorial. The headline was bold: "Luxury for our enemies?" Her hand tightened on the metal wastebasket. She forced herself to read. The words were dense, angry. The writer was not addressing the war. He was addressing the camp. He was addressing her. The article complained about the cost to the taxpayers. It spoke of local farm boys eating cold rations in muddy holes in the Pacific, while Jap prisoners right here in Wisconsin were being coddled. Hannah scanned the lines, her dictionary-trained mind picking out the key nouns. The editorialist was enraged that the prisoners at Camp McCoy received 3 hot meals a day. He was furious that the Army provided them with heated barracks, clean uniforms, and endless supplies of hot water. The article reached its peak of fury when it mentioned the sanitation. It described, with acid sarcasm, the modern plumbing conveniences and endless rolls of paper afforded to the enemy, comforts that, he claimed, many hard-working local families still lived without. Hannah put the wastebasket down, her knees weak. She had expected hatred, vitriol, calls for violence. She had not expected jealousy. The Americans knew. They knew these things were luxuries: the chaplain's pie, the hot water, the porcelain thrones, and the mountain of soft paper in the closet. They were not accidents. They were not simply the American standard. They were a policy. It was a policy so extravagant that even other Americans were angered by it. The realization shifted her perspective entirely. This was not carelessness. This was a deliberate demonstration. The United States Army was not just imprisoning them. It was actively, consciously, and controversially displaying its bottomless wealth. The endless paper, the hot water, they were weapons. They were a form of soft power so potent that it made their own citizens angry. She quickly finished her work, her mind racing. The wastefulness was not waste at all. It was a message. The arrival of a new contingent of female prisoners from a holding camp in Idaho reset the fragile equilibrium. The cycle of shame began anew. Hannah watched them from her bunk, seeing her own terror mirrored in their eyes. She heard the same hesitant whispers outside the latrine door, saw the same muddy footprints on the porcelain seats the next morning. The illustrated sign, now faded, was ignored or misunderstood. The WWII guards, who had grown accustomed to the compliance of Hannah's group, were losing their patience. Their voices were sharp again, their inspections more critical. Hana felt the old humiliation rising, but this time it was mixed with a new, unfamiliar sensation: impatience. She understood the system now. She had read the newspaper. She knew the logic. This continued confusion was needless. It was a failure of communication, a weakness the guards would exploit. She found herself standing before Mrs. Sato, the midwife, her hands clasped tightly. "We must show them," Hana said, her voice quiet but firm. Mrs. Sato looked up from her mending, her eyes assessing. "Show them what, child? How to be American?" "No," Hana said, the word sharper than she intended. "How to be clean. How to survive this place. They will punish all of us for the mistakes of a few." The older woman studied her for a long moment, then nodded once. "Do it." That evening, Hana gathered the new women, along with Yuki and a few others, in the quiet corner of the barrack, near the humming stove. The air was thick with embarrassment. This was a topic no one spoke of. Hana did not begin with the porcelain throne. She began with the paper. She had saved a soft paper roll from her cleaning duties. She held it up. It was white, dense, and perfect. "This is the first problem," she said, her voice shaking slightly. The women stared at the roll as if it were a talisman. "In Japan, paper is precious," Hana said. "We save it. We reuse it. This is not that paper." She pulled a long strip from the roll, the sound sibilant in the quiet room. "This paper is made of weak fibers. It is designed to be used once. It is designed to be destroyed." She walked them to the latrine, which was empty before curfew. She knelt by the nearest toilet. "This paper," she continued, tearing a piece and dropping it into the clean water of the bowl, "is made to dissolve. Watch." She pushed the lever. The water roared and the paper vanished. The women gasped. "Its purpose is to disappear," Hana explained. "The machine is built for the paper. The paper is built for the machine. It is a system." She looked at the new arrivals. "You are not being wasteful. You are using it correctly. The crime to them is not using it. The crime is the mud on the seat." She was defending the enemy's logic. She was explaining the rationale of a disposable culture. And as she said the word, she realized with a startling clarity that she believed them. It was not decadent, or at least not just decadent. It was efficient. It was an engineering solution. The women were silent. The shame that had frozen them had broken. A young woman, one of the newcomers, pointed at the lever. "And the water, it is clean?" "It is always clean," Hana said. "They have more water than we have air." The atmosphere shifted. The fear was replaced by a cautious, technical curiosity. One by one, they began to practice. They touched the paper. They pushed the levers. The latrine filled with the sound of flushing water, a roaring chorus of sudden, startling understanding. December 14th, 1945. The date meant little, just another mark on a calendar she did not keep. But the cold was deeper. The snow piled high against the barracks. Hana was no longer a newcomer. She was a veteran of the sanitation roster, a supervisor of the mending circle. She understood the rhythms of the camp, the smell of lye on cleaning days, the hiss of the radiators, the precise economic anger of the guards. That afternoon, a new truck arrived, grinding its gears in the heavy snow. A fresh group of women was processed, a small contingent of civilians captured in the final, desperate weeks on the mainland. They were thin, their eyes wide with the same animal terror Hana remembered feeling. Hana was assigned to help settle them, to distribute blankets and soap. She watched them cluster near the stove, soaking in the unfamiliar, dry heat. One girl, younger than the rest, perhaps 16, was trembling so violently she could barely stand. Her name was Yuki. As curfew approached, the inevitable moment arrived. A WAC guard, The same tall private whose face Hana now knew well stood by the latrine door. "Wash!" the guard commanded, her voice flat. "Curfew." The new women shuffled forward, pushed by the order. Hana followed, standing back, knowing what was coming. The group stopped at the threshold. The smell hit them first. Sharp lye, biting and cold. Hana watched the young one, Yuki, freeze. The girl's eyes fixed on the row of gleaming white objects. She had never seen one. Yuki whispered to the woman next. To her voice thin with disbelief. "Hana-san, they sit on it?" Hana stepped forward instinctively, placing her hand on the younger girl's shoulder, pulling Yuki back slightly. It was a reflex of protection, of shared memory. A heavy boot scraped the concrete floor. The WWII guard stood in the doorway, her presence routine, not threatening. She saw the hesitation. She saw the terror in Yuki's eyes. This was a scene the guard had witnessed many times. With a sigh of weary duty, the guard pointed to the nearest porcelain throne. "It's all right," the guard said, her voice not unkind, just tired. "It's for sanitation." To demonstrate, the guard stepped into the stall and pulled the metal chain. A sudden, violent roar of water erupted, swallowing the silence. Yuki screamed. She flinched, hiding her face in Hana's thin coat, her body rigid. The other new women recoiled, terrified by the sudden, aggressive noise. 6 weeks ago, Hana had been that girl. She had felt that same cold dread, that same instinctive terror at the machine's power. Now, she felt only a calm resolve. She kept her hand on Yuki's shoulder. As the water subsided, Hana looked at the WWII guard. The guard nodded, a silent transfer of authority. Hana turned to Yuki and the others. She spoke in Japanese, her voice low and steady, cutting through their panic. "It is all right," she said, echoing the American's words. "Water. It is only for sanitation." She stepped past them, walked to the wall, and calmly tore a piece from the paper roll. She held it out to Yuki. The girl stared at it, her fear-widened eyes moving from the soft paper to Hana's face. "Do not be afraid," Hana said. "This is how it works. They have plenty of it." Spring came late to Wisconsin, but it came. The formidable snowdrifts receded, exposing the damp, dark earth. The air, once sharp enough to cut, now carried the scent of wet pine and melting ice. With the thaw came the final news: repatriation. They were going home. Hana sat on her cot, the late afternoon sun streaming through the barrack window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The oppressive heat of the coal stove was gone. The air felt light. In her lap, she held a precious commodity, a few sheets of official camp stationery and a pencil, provided for letters home. She had been staring at the blank page for an hour. What could she write? How could she explain the last year? She could not write about the terror of the capture, or the hollow hunger of the final days on Saipan. She could not describe the shame of the delousing, or the initial bone-deep fear of the tall American guards, and she certainly could not describe the slow, agonizing realization that their nation had been utterly, comprehensively defeated. How could a few lines of censored graphite convey a collapsed worldview? Her family was waiting for a survivor. They were not waiting for a convert. She looked at her hands. They were clean. The nails were trimmed. The skin, though chapped from the winter, was not broken. She thought of the small, paper-wrapped bar of soap she had been given, and the endless supply that followed. From the end of the hall, she heard the familiar, distant roar of a flushing porcelain throne. It was not a sound of terror anymore. It was not even a sound of curiosity. It was simply a fact, as mundane as the birdsong now audible through the open window. It was the sound of an infrastructure so vast and robust it operated without thought. She put the pencil to the paper. She did not write about the soldiers. She did not write about the food, or the cold, or the fear. She wrote simply, "Everything here is clean." She described the latrine. She wrote about the white porcelain chairs that cleaned themselves with a roar of endless water. She tried to describe the paper. "It is softer than silk," she wrote, "and there is no end to it. They have mountains of it, stored in closets. We use it for everything. They do not value it. They simply have it." She paused, looking at the words. It sounded insane. It sounded like the ramblings of someone obsessed with trivial things. But she knew, with a certainty that chilled her more than the Wisconsin winter, that this was the only important thing. This was the secret. "How could we have won?" she wrote, knowing this line would be censored, but needing to write it. "How could we fight a people who can afford to flush such luxury away every minute of every day?" She realized they had not been defeated by the bombs alone, though the bombs were terrible. They had been defeated by the pipes. They had been defeated by the factories that churned out millions of useless, perfect, soft paper rolls. They had been defeated by an abundance so profound that it treated sanitation like a luxury, and luxury like a disposable fact. She folded the letter, knowing most of it would not be understood. She listened to the sounds of English chatter outside the window, no longer menacing, just noise. She was ready to go home. But the person returning to Kagoshima was not the same one who had left. She was returning with a heavy, impossible knowledge, the precise material weight of American soft power.